It was late evening, 16th of September, year 2000. Georgii picked his things, phone, voice recorder, wallet, and left the editorial office. It was quite chilly outside and Georgii decided to catch a cab home. Soon he stopped a car and sat down in the backseat. He knew that he's been followed but didn't expect to see several men jumping into the car immediately after him. The doors closed and the car quickly disappeared, dissolving in the traffic, overwhelming the evening streets of Kyiv. Georgii never returned home. My friends, I'm operator Starsky, and this is the story of a truly legendary person, a Ukrainian journalist known for his enormous courage and dedication. His name was Georgii Gongadze. Friends called him Gia. Post-Soviet Ukraine in 1990s was an extremely dynamic country. Dangerous too. 90s in Ukraine were remembered for numerous criminal wars between gangs that plagued the post-Soviet space. Countries like Poland, Georgia, Russia, Belarus, Romania and Bulgaria, everybody older than 30 probably remember those absolutely crazy times. How were the gang wars stopped in Ukraine? The answer is not that difficult. The worst bandits survived. The rest were not so lucky. Those who survived eventually decided to become politicians. A prominent example is Viktor Yanukovych, the last pro-Russian Ukrainian president who fled to Russia in 2014. The man has been convicted 3 times before his presidency. It was the time when Ukrainian media were born, the fourth power, as we used to call them. Young and talented journalist Georgii Gongadze became an icon in the Ukrainian media of the 1990s. A prominent son of the Georgian land, veteran of the Russian hybrid war in Abkhazia in 1992, Georgii always used to say, "I'm Georgian, but if needed, I will give my life for Ukraine." This man was known for his sincere love to Ukraine. He actively fought for its independence before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and eventually he dedicated his life to fighting corruption. Georgii was famous for his journalist investigations. In the middle 90s, he worked on different TV channels and in 1999 launched his own show at the Ukrainian radio station Continent. Shortly after that, the radio station received multiple anonymous threats because Georgii exposed numerous corrupted people in his investigations and gained a lot of enemies among the top leadership of the country. Back in those days, Leonid Kuchma was the president of Ukraine. Historically, he was remembered as a person who managed to keep stable relations both with the West and Russia. He was the one, by the way, who signed memorandum with Putin in 2003, recognizing existing borders of Ukraine, including Donbass and Crimea. But you know what they say, if you want everybody to like you, in the end nobody will like you. It was exactly the case with Leonid Kuchma. Because of extremely slow reforms, low transparency and high corruption among his closest relatives and partners, the Western countries weren't really happy with him. At the same time, partnership with the West spoiled his relations with Putin, otherwise known as Huilo, and Kuchma was heavily criticized by both factions. In 1999, Kuchma had a visit to the United States. What did Georgii do? He wrote a collective letter to the American Congress describing repressions against the freedom of speech in Ukraine. More than 100 of Ukrainian journalists signed the letter, and Georgii went to the US to deliver this message to the American government. During his trip to the US, Georgii became extremely inspired with the idea of creating his own web-based news outlet. In year 2000, Georgii founded a news agency Ukrainska Pravda, which, by the way, exists to this day. He often worked directly in the Ukrainian parliament, observing historical decisions from the very, very heart of political life of Ukraine. As soon as he founded his agency, he began investigating cases of corruption within the closest circles of Leonid Kuchma. President Kuchma watched Georgii Gongadze really closely. In the mid-90s, Georgii presented his investigation called Kuchma Clan, which provoked enormous conflict between Gongadze and the Ukrainian president. And Georgii didn't stop there. He was impossible to bribe. Nobody could intimidate or shut him up. Because Georgii was the man of principles, he had numerous conflicts not only with the corrupted management of the country, but also with his friends and colleagues. Georgii was extremely dedicated to his work, and since his investigations always had enormous social resonance, in year 2000 he noticed that he and his family were being watched. Georgii started recording the numbers of the plates of suspicious cars that were following him. His friends advised him to write a letter to the prosecutor general and ask to investigate and protect him. Once again, it was a dangerous period. People used to disappear back in those days. One time Georgii came home and told his wife Miroslava that situation became so threatening, so they were advised to leave Kiev at least for a while. However, according to his wife, they didn't have much money to go anywhere, and Georgii kept finding new evidence of the nefarious activities of President Kuchma and his people. Miroslava begged Georgii to change his rhetorics at least a bit, but it was impossible. Georgii was stubborn, dedicated, and brave. On 16th of September year 2000, Georgii was seen leaving his agency, but he didn't return home. His wife Miroslava had a feeling that something bad could have happened to her husband. Next day, she gathered her friends, the journalists, and held a press conference. She reached out to the law enforcement, the prosecutor, and did all she could to find Georgii. The investigators literally didn't want to do anything to help, but due to the incessant publicity, this crime managed to raise awareness. Almost 2 months passed until in early November, approximately 100 kilometers away from Kiev, around the village of Tarasha, a decapitated body was found. There were evidence showing that the body belonged to Georgii Gongadze. An X-ray examination showed metal fragments stuck in the body. Georgii has been wounded during the war in Abkhazia. Also, the watermelon seeds were found in the stomach. Before his vanishing, Georgii had watermelon. Miroslava was called by a friend of her family who told her, "We found him." Still, a DNA test had to be made because the body lacked head and was mutilated, therefore it couldn't be properly identified. But that very moment, Miroslava understood that there's pretty much no hope to ever see her husband alive. She came to the office of the prosecutor asking to show her the body, and the prosecutor refused. Then the police began moving the body from place to place, hiding it from Miroslava. It was apparent that the police tried to get rid of the evidence. In the end, after almost a month of writing reports and inquiries, Miroslava was allowed to see the body. In December, she came to the morgue. The forensic expert gave her a bunch of bones and said, "Here's the fingers." Then he showed her partially decomposed, decapitated body, which was really hard to identify. The cops knew for sure, if there's no body, there is no crime, and according to Miroslava Gongadze, they did everything they could to make sure she would not identify her husband. She insisted on making the DNA test. In total, 6 tests were made in Ukraine, Russia, France, and the US. The FBI's experts were straightforward. "This is Georgii," they told Miroslava. But Georgii's mother, Lesia Gongadze, still refused to believe that the body belonged to her son. That's why another DNA test was made in France. So what about the corrupted investigators? They were all saying the same. It was not Georgii Gongadze, but in late November that very year, another crucial thing took place. An officer of the Security Service of Ukraine, Major Mykola Melnichenko, published audio records allegedly made in the office of the President Kuchma. On those records there were voices of 4 people who sounded like President Leonid Kuchma, chief of his administration Volodymyr Litvin, Minister of Interior Yuri Kravchenko, and head of the Security Service of Ukraine Leonid Derkach. These people were talking about Georgii Gongadze, discussing what to do with him. On the records they were cursing Georgii Gongadze for his activities. Kuchma several times offered Minister of Interior to kidnap and abandon him somewhere in deserted place or take him to the Chechens. Minister of Interior bragged about his guys, whom he called eagles, who could do anything. He said they needed a bit more time to prepare. He also admitted that his people were following Gongadze and learning about his contacts. Also, these characters were nagging about being unable to control the media and other things. As it happens in such cases in Ukraine, when the government oppresses people, the people rise up. A massive protest action called Ukraine Without Kuchma took place in Kyiv and almost turned into a revolution when the activists attempted to take control over the presidential administration. I'm a bit proud to say I also took part in that protest. It was 9th of March 2001, I was 15, and that day I ditched school to participate in the protest march. Fun fact that I've learned almost 15 years later was that back then I was throwing stones at an officer who later became my commander in the 4th Operative Brigade. Life is crazy. But nonetheless, the social resonance was insane. Under the great pressure, the government agreed to start the investigation. And as you may probably expect, it was the most ridiculous investigation ever. In May 2001, Kuchma stated he knew the names of the murderers. Next day, a new Minister of Interior, Yuri Smirnov, stated that the deceased was murdered by 2 gangsters who in turn died the same year. And only almost 2 years later, in September 2002, the Prosecutor General admitted that the body belonged to Georgii Gongadze. The investigation would restart several times with different versions, different suspects and motives, and only after the Orange Revolution of 2004-2005 the real investigation took place. New democratically elected President Viktor Yushchenko stated that solving this case was his personal priority. Already former President Kuchma and others were being interrogated. However, the main suspect, former Minister of Interior Yuri Kravchenko, didn't survive. The day before being interrogated, his body was found at home. The general was shot twice in the back of his head. And because the old law enforcement system was still full of the same corrupted servicemen, the investigators concluded that it was a suicide. 2 shots to the back of the head, a suicide. Speaking of suspects, 3 former experts of reconnaissance and external surveillance of the police were arrested and faced charges. They received 12 and 13 years in prison, and one of them later died. But the main murderer was only arrested in 2009. General Oleksiy Pukach, chief of the Reconnaissance and External Surveillance Department of the police, was detained in his own village, because until that day nobody wanted to even search for him despite having an arrest warrant. General Pukach immediately confessed and admitted that he and 3 other officers were involved in kidnapping and killing Georgii Gongadze. He also stated the name of the person who ordered this assassination, General Alexander Kravchenko, the one who earlier died from 2 shots to the back of his head. Oleksiy Pukach showed the place where Georgii's head was buried. This is how almost a decade after his death, the investigators finally discovered the remains of head of Georgii Gongadze. Also at the same spot, rubber gloves were found worn by General Pukach when he was decapitating the journalist. General Pukac stated that the assassins didn't plan to murder Gongadze. According to the murderer, they put a belt on his neck and accidentally killed him. After that, the murderers buried the body, but 2 weeks after his assassination, General Kravchenko told General Pukac to hide the body in a different place. Pukac bought an axe and medical gloves. Then he used a service car belonging to the Ministry of Interior to relocate the body approximately 20 kilometers away to a different spot. There, Pukac removed the head and buried it not far from that place. The prosecutor general pressed charges against former President Leonid Kuchma in 2011, but the same year the Constitutional Court cancelled the charges, stating that the evidence received illegally, speaking of the voice recordings, cannot be used to prove someone's guilt. This is how all the charges against Kuchma were removed and he remained free, unfortunately to this day, because his guilt was not proved. General Pukac was found guilty and in 2013 he received life in prison. He also stated he will only accept this decision if Kuchma and Litwin will share the cell with him. But the story doesn't end here, my friends. The chain of tragic events kept following the body of Georgii Gongadze years after his death. His mother wouldn't allow to bury her son because she never accepted the fact of his death. Even despite his widow Miroslava Gongadze begged her to bury the body, Lesya Gongadze would not identify the body as Georgii. Later that year, in November 2013, Lesya Gongadze died, and only 3 years after her death, Georgii Gongadze was finally buried in the church of Mykola Naberezhny in Kiev. So now, when the case was partially solved with the main organizers of this crime either dead or not proved guilty, it looks like we know most of the details. There were several conspiracies surrounding this case. One of them, for example, involved Russians because it was considered that Kuchma and Putin's relations deteriorated and the Russian dictator decided to remove him. This is how, according to this conspiracy, the records emerged, because on the audio files President Kuchma was speaking through phone. It didn't seem like he was recorded using a bug or some kind of voice recorder. Also, in order to make these records public, Major Melnichenko passed them to Alexander Moroz, head of the Socialist Party that was in opposition to Kuchma at that time. Alexander Moroz later became one of the closest supporters of the pro-Russian president Yanukovych, the one who led Ukraine to the Revolution of Dignity and fled to Russia when it finished. Back in 2003, there was a territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine over the island of Tuzla, located not far from Crimea, and Kuchma managed to keep the island by deploying the armed forces on it. The conflict was resolved with Kuchma and Putin signing the agreement recognizing the international borders of Russia and Ukraine, which of course Putin never considered seriously. I mean, we're talking about Russia. With or without Russia involved, it doesn't justify Kuchma and the executors of this horrible murder. Georgii Gongadze's life was a shining example of courage, truth and sacrifice. He wasn't just a journalist, he was a fearless fighter for justice who gave everything to expose corruption and defend the future of Ukraine. His brutal murder in 2000 didn't just break hearts, it opened the eyes of a nation. Gongadze's sacrifice wasn't in vain. His fight for truth sparked a revolution in Ukraine's press and its people. He became a symbol of courage, of what it means to truly believe in a cause greater than yourself. His work and his bravery live on, inspiring every new generation of journalists, activists, and citizens who continue the struggle for a better, freer Ukraine. Georgii Gongadze gave his life for truth, and in doing so, he gave hope to an entire Ukrainian nation. His spirit will always burn bright, reminding us of the power of one person's courage to change the course of history.